All right, this video is going to help you review for the quiz over slavery and westward expansion. So I'm just going to talk over the study guide like I did in the last video. So the best thing for you to have out right now would be something to write with and your study guide. Feel free to pause the video at any point in time to help you fill in some of the information for your study guide. So the first topic that I'm going to review over is westward expansion. There's a vocabulary section on that, and there's 6 things that you need to match. So on your study guide, you should be writing out a description of the land acquisition for each of the following territories that the United States acquired. So for the Florida Territory, this land was given to the United States through the Adams-Onis Treaty after Andrew Jackson invaded the area without permission. So instead of going to war, the United States and Spain, they simply sat down and decided that Spain would give the United States Florida. And in return, we would give Spain, I believe, $5 million. And we would also give up some land claims that we had in the area of Texas. Moving on to the Gadsden Purchase, this is that very small strip of land that was purchased in order to finish building a railroad. A lot of people felt like the Gadsden Purchase was the last little bit of land that the United States needed in order to fully achieve manifest destiny. And that occurred in 1853. And the next one is the Louisiana Purchase. This was purchased in 1803 from France in order for Napoleon to continue to fund his war in Europe. The Louisiana Purchase was during the time period of Thomas Jefferson's presidency, and he justified purchasing the territory by saying that he was creating a treaty with France. The Louisiana Purchase is significant because it is going to double the size of the United States. The next one is the Mexican Cession. This was added to the United States through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo after winning the Mexican-American War. And the Mexican Cession contains pieces of at least 9 different states in the United States. So places like California, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming. Oregon Country, this is the area of land in the upper northwest corner of the United States. This area was once controlled by 4 different countries: Britain, Russia, Spain, and the United States. All 4 of these countries made land claims in this area. Eventually, Russia and Spain are going to drop out, and it's just going to be a battle between Britain and the United States. And instead of going to war, Britain and the United States sit down and decide to come up with a compromise. And it is going to become part of the United States after reaching that agreement with Britain in 1846. And the last land area that you're going to have to match on the quiz is the Texas annexation. Remember, to annex means to add or to take over. So this Texas annexation is an area that was once its own country for 9 years after declaring independence from Mexico, and then it was added to the United States through a vote in Congress. And this occurred because Texas was bankrupt during its 9 years as its own individual country, and they were also struggling to deal with Native Americans living in the area. And there were already a lot of U.S. citizens already living in the area of Texas. So at that point, it just kind of made sense to add Texas to the United States. All right, now the next part of this is the content knowledge section. So there are many questions in this section. However, on the test, there are only going to be 5 multiple choice questions in regards to this section. Okay, so some of these questions are helping you gain a deeper understanding of the thing. So you'll notice there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There's 11 questions in this content knowledge section, but there's only 5 multiple choice questions on the test. So this is helping you develop a deeper understanding of the information. So what is the Erie Canal? Well, the Erie Canal is a man-made canal that connected the Mohawk and Hudson rivers to the Great Lakes. And in early westward movement, canals were very important because they helped people connect rivers and lakes. They helped people move up in elevation. But the Erie Canal specifically is going to be a significant improvement in river transportation for farmers in the West, because it allowed those farmers the ability to ship their goods directly to markets in the East. So we've got new developments in transportation during this time period, but those developments are not solving a fundamental problem, which is how do we connect farmers in the West to markets in the East? And the Erie Canal was the way that they solved that problem. All right, now what is the Claremont? The Claremont was a steamship that was developed by Robert Fulton, who was a inventor during the time. And the Claremont specifically became the first full-size U.S. commercial steamboat. So what that means is that the Claremont was kind of the first time that the United States was transporting individuals and goods all on the same ship. And it was the first full-size one to run a successful trip across a body of water. Now, the Claremont is going to be significant because it was an early improvement in river transportation that not only made travel faster, but it also made travel cheaper, not steeper. Sorry, guys. It's going to make it cheaper, so it's going to cost less money, and that's because they're going to use the power of steam. So the steam engine invention is going to have a dramatic impact on transportation, not only with the Transcontinental Railroad, but also with steamships like the Claremont. Now, these next several questions are talking about just the different types of roads that were around in the United States. Now, the National Road is a road that stretched from Cumberland, Maryland to Wheeling, Ohio. And this road specifically was funded by the federal government, which is why it's called the National Road, because the national government funded this. Early on, it was referred to as the Cumberland Road because it got its start in Cumberland, Maryland. However, when the federal government took over and started completing this road and expanding it to cross into other states, they renamed it the National Road. Now, corduroy roads are early primitive roads that were made out of logs. So you would line up logs next to each other, and these specific roads, through the use of logs, were designed to keep wagons from sinking in the mud. So corduroy roads were used in areas where heavy rainfall would create very muddy pathways, which would then be a very big hazard to wagons, especially wagons who were loaded down with goods, or even just loaded down with people who were moving from one area of the country to another area. So these corduroy roads were a significant improvement in transportation over the landscape because it provided a safer way for wagons to travel through mud. As those logs were run over by multiple wagons, they would sink further and further into the ground, and then eventually over time create a bit smoother of a road surface for those wagons to travel on. Now, the Great Valley Road. This is an early pathway, very, very early, where there are people who are traveling through the Appalachian Mountains on this early pathway. And the Lancaster Turnpike is another early road, but this road is slightly different because it's going to be built by private companies, and they're going to pay for the road by collecting tolls. Okay, and this is where that word turnpike comes in. So I explained in class that you've got almost like a gate, and they refer to that gate as the pike. And so when your wagon travels up to the turnpike, you pay your toll, and then they actually physically turn the pike in the opposite direction that allows the wagon to then travel through. So turnpikes are going to be roads that are going to be made by private companies. And those private companies are going to collect those tolls and then use those tolls to make improvements to the road or to continue building onto the road. The Oregon Trail is next. The Oregon Trail is a pathway that early pioneers took to travel out to Oregon country. I believe I mentioned this in one of the classes, but I watched a video a few years ago where they took aerial views of where they believed the wagon trail was, because they could see ruts in the road or divots, markings in the ground from many, many wagons traveling through that area. So the Oregon Trail traveled through places like Missouri, Nebraska, on north into the South Dakota area, Montana, Idaho, all the way out to Oregon Trail or Oregon country via the Oregon Trail. So Oregon Trail leads to Oregon country. And for the Trail of Tears, this is a pathway that Cherokee Native Americans took when they were being forcibly removed from their native lands in the east to Indian Territory in the west. If you Google a map of the Trail of Tears, you'll see that there were several different pathways, and it wasn't just the Cherokee tribe that traveled on the Trail of Tears. There were other tribes like the Chickasaws and the Choctaws and even the Seminoles down in Florida. So depending on what tribe was being removed, depended on what pathway they took. However, the Trail of Tears is specific to the Cherokee. So you will want to remember that the Cherokee Native Indians were the ones that were removed along the Trail of Tears. And the last section for westward movement or westward expansion is explaining what manifest destiny is. Manifest destiny, remember, is a belief, and that's why it's different from westward expansion. So manifest destiny is that belief that Americans had that the United States was destined to stretch from the Atlantic Ocean all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. All right, moving on to topic 2, which is slavery. Again, there's a vocabulary section. So there's 8 words that you need to match for the vocabulary section for this. And that vocab section starts with the word abolition, which is simply an end to slavery or the complete end to slavery or a permanent end to slavery. Those are multiple definitions that kind of circulate around the word abolition. But you just need to know that abolition ends slavery. Folk tales are stories that often provided moral lessons. Folk tales were used a lot in slave culture. They were a mainstay in slave culture because oftentimes that moral lesson was a way for slaves to learn how to kind of like pull one over or dupe their slave owners. Oftentimes, these moral lessons involved animals, and it was how one animal was able to trick another animal into doing whatever they wanted to do. And so slaves would often draw similarities between the animals in the stories and then their lives as slaves. So folk tales were something that were told often in slave culture. The next vocabulary word for the slavery section is the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about the Fugitive Slave Act when we talk about sectionalism after this test. But what you need to know for this test is that it was a law that made it a crime to help runaway slaves, and it allowed for the arrest of escaped slaves in areas where slavery was illegal. And it required the return of escaped slaves to their slave holders. So a bounty hunter or someone who makes a living off of returning escaped slaves to their slave owners could travel into the northern region of the United States where slavery is illegal, and they could capture those runaway slaves and then return them back to their owners down in the South. This was a very unpopular law that was passed in the 1850s. The Middle Passage is simply the voyage that brought enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to North America and to the West Indies. If you remember from our studies, there were 1 in 6 Africans died along the Middle Passage, and that death could have occurred because of a lack of food. It could have occurred because of disease. And then some Africans even took their own lives on the voyage because they were trying to prevent themselves from becoming slaves. Overseers are going to be men who are hired by farmers and planters to oversee and direct the work of slaves. Overseers are not always white men. Some plantation owners even paid some of their slaves to be overseers, and exerted a different level of psychological control, not only on the rest of their slaves, but also on the slave overseers that they put in those positions. The definition that we are going to use for the word slave is a human being who is the legal property of another human being. And then spirituals are emotional Christian songs that were sung by enslaved people in the South that mixed African and European elements and usually expressed slaves' religious beliefs. Spirituals could mix several different African cultures because not all slaves were of the same African culture or spoke the same African language either. So it could mix several different African cultures together, along with some European elements as well. Spirituals are going to be songs that slaves would sing to kind of mentally allow them to escape the hardships of slavery that they face day to day. And finally, the Underground Railroad. So the Underground Railroad is not underground, and it is not a railroad. Okay, it is simply a network of people who helped thousands of enslaved people escape to the North by providing transportation, hiding places, meeting points, and even food and clothing. All right, now on to the content knowledge section. So there are going to be 6 multiple choice questions and 1 categorization question. There's 2 multiple choice questions in this section that are worth 3 points each. So in the directions for the question, it will tell you to select 3 answers. Make sure that you do so that you can earn the full points. If for some reason you select 1 answer and it's not correct, but the other 2 answers that you select are correct, you would receive 2 out of the 3 points for that question. Okay, so it is possible for you to earn partial credit on those multiple choice questions that are worth multiple points. Same thing with the categorization question. Okay, you're going to have a series of statements, and then you're going to have to place that statement in the correct category. So let's say you get 2 of the statements wrong, then you would get 4 out of the 6 points for that question. Okay, so plantation owners using Africans as a slave labor force. So why did that happen? Well, there's 3 main answers for that one. The first one is that many Native Americans that they were using as slave labor ended up dying from European diseases because they didn't have the necessary immunity to those diseases. So their workforce was being wiped out. Another reason why Africans started to be used was that Africans had already developed immunity to those European diseases. So contact between Africa and Europe had been happening for several hundreds of years at this point, and they had already had enough time to develop immunity to those diseases. So Africans were not being killed nearly as often by European diseases as Native Americans were. And then the last one, plantations are going to need a very large number of laborers. So they're going to look to the large population of Africans in Africa to supply that large number of laborers. So to recap the reasons why Africans are being used as a labor force, number 1, Native Americans are dying from European diseases because they don't have immunity. Number 2, Africans who have immunity now are going to be used because we don't have to worry about them dying out. And number 3, the population of Africans is very, very high, and plantations need a very large number of laborers. Now, describing slave culture. Slave culture is a very wide topic, but to hit on a couple of the highlights of things that we have talked about as far as our study of slavery. First thing, family and religion are going to be very, very important aspects to slave culture. When it comes to families, even though there is a threat of their family being ripped apart and sold off to different plantations, families are still going to be a very important part of slave culture because it gives slaves sort of a refuge from that day-to-day struggle of slave life. It gives them a sense of normalcy as well. Plantation owners are going to encourage their slaves to marry, therefore encouraging their slaves to have children. By having children, slaves are replenishing that slave labor in a very natural way. So families are going to be something that slaves are going to hold as a refuge, and even slave owners are going to push that on their slaves as well. Religion, also another very important aspect to slavery. Religion gives slaves a sense of hope and a sense of salvation that maybe if they cannot experience freedom in this life, then maybe in the next life they would be able to receive freedom in some way spiritually. Slaves are going to use spirituals to share their message and give them kind of another escape through the music and the song and even dance, all really good forms of self-expression for slaves. Another way that a slave could kind of express their own likes and dislikes would be through the use of colorful fabric. If their plantation owner allowed them to do that, they could sew in patches and things that would maybe refer to Bible verses and things like that. Slave owners themselves are also going to encourage slaves to become Christian, mainly because they are going to focus their attention on stories in the Bible that are surrounded by obedience to the master. It's going to be a way that slave owners are going to help justify the owning slaves and kind of reiterate to their slaves that obeying your master is the most important thing. Folk tales are going to be told a lot. Those folk tales are all going to be stories that kind of have some sort of a moral message, so a lesson that slaves need to learn. In slave cultures on one plantation, there could be many different languages spoken. There could also be many different cultures as well. So as slaves from different parts of Africa start to meet each other, then they start to develop almost their own type of culture within the plantation as well. Moving on to describe conditions, types of jobs, and responsibilities that slaves had. When it came to working in the fields, working in the fields was the main part of this was cotton, tobacco, tending to animals, maybe even tending to your own gardens. Oftentimes, slaves were able to keep their own gardens as kind of another way to kind of have some sort of normalcy. But if you were a slave that worked in the field, you worked from sunup to sundown. Oftentimes, you did not have the greatest food or clothing. And you worked in the gang labor system, which meant that there were lots of people all doing the same job. So that job would be done all at the same time as well. So you would see, numerous slaves in the rows of the tobacco fields cultivating the tobacco or picking cotton from the cotton plant itself. So the gang labor system is simply a group of slaves all completing the same job all at the same time. Oftentimes, working in the fields was the hardest slave labor that was performed as well. Working in the planters' homes, sometimes what this meant is that slaves were available to their planters and serving the family for 24 hours a day. So that means that some of these slaves would be maybe living in a separate part of the house, on the third floor of the house. Oftentimes that was a place where slaves were kept who worked in the planter's home. But some of these slaves would need to be required at all times. So they could be woken up in the middle of the night to tend to various things of the slave owners. Oftentimes, slaves that worked in the homes had better food and better clothing. They were kind of treated a little bit better. Most of the time, that's because they're going to be seen by more people than your field hands or your slaves that work in the fields. But the jobs that slaves would perform in the home would be things like cleaning, cooking, odd jobs around the house, like fixing things. Male slaves would be butlers or drivers, so they would drive the carriage into town so that their slave owner could run businesses in town or run business duties, run errands. Females would be more responsible for the cleaning and cooking. They could also be responsible for being a seamstress, so mending clothing as well, not just for the slave owners, but also for other slaves. And then even tending to children as well. Most of the time, it's going to be women and children who are going to serve in the planter's home, with the exception of a few male slaves as well. Now, working at a skilled job in a town or a city. Now, those skilled jobs include things like carpentry or blacksmithing. These were slaves who could sell their services to other plantations. So if you had a blacksmith that was a slave, or a slave that was a blacksmith, and you didn't need any blacksmithing on your plantation, but the plantation 10 miles down the road did, that slave could sell their service of blacksmithing to that other plantation. Now, in return for selling their service, those slaves would be able to keep a small portion of what they earned, but money would also be given to the slaveholder themselves. Some of these slaves that had skilled jobs were also able to earn enough money to be able to buy their freedom eventually. Now, living conditions of the slaves were very, very poor. The homes themselves were usually dirt floor shacks with very little furniture in them. Food and clothing was usually meant to be very minimal. So they would provide just enough food so that it would be adequate for them to be able to perform their labor duties the next day. Clothing, again, would be very minimal. It would be just enough to, maybe keep them warm in the colder months, and then keep them cool in the warmer months. Slaves were forced to work in horrible conditions all the time. Punishments like branding or beatings were used very often by slave owners to exert extra control, to force slaves to work harder or to get more work done. Slaves also were not allowed to learn how to read or write. And sometimes families could be separated at any point in time as well. So even though slaves were encouraged to marry and have children, there was still the threat of that marriage being broken up or that family being broken up and your children being sold off to other plantations. There were some bright spots in slavery, however. Families also could be seen as that sort of refuge from the day-to-day struggle, give them a sense of normalcy. Religion is also going to be something that is going to be a refuge for slaves. Depending on the plantation, sometimes slaves could keep their own gardens. So with the very minimal amount of time that they would have at the end of the day with their slave duties, then they could also keep gardens themselves. And then sometimes they were allowed to even decorate their clothing to kind of show off a little bit of their own culture and their individualism. Slaves also resisted slavery in their own ways. A couple of ways that slaves would resist slavery would be performing the jobs slowly, damaging goods on purpose or damaging farm equipment, carrying out orders in the wrong way, running away to either escape slavery to freedom in the North or to even visit family members on neighboring plantations. Those were all forms of resistance that slaves did to resist slavery. Armed rebellions as well were also part of that, or other revolts. Probably the biggest result of armed rebellions like the Stono Rebellion and Nat Turner's Rebellion and the rebellion that Denmark Vesey led, was the plantation owners would create more strict slave codes. Slave codes are laws that were designed to restrict the behavior of slaves. So an example of a slave code would be no more than 2 slaves can be meeting or talking at the same time. Slaves could not have access to or own a weapon of any sort. So as a result of these slave rebellions that occurred, slave owners would feel the pressure to try to exert more control over their slaves, prevent them from having the ability to be able to get together to plan and meet and to plan a slave revolt. It would restrict their access to weapons, restrict their access to knowledge. So again, not being able to learn how to read and write, because if you can read and write, then you can create a map, and then that map could be used to help you escape. Now, the 3 rebellions that I mentioned, the Stono Rebellion, Nat Turner, and Denmark Vesey, all have very similar sort of backgrounds. Basically, you have slaves that are kind of coming together to kind of rebel. And usually that rebellion is going to involve burning down plantations, killing whites along the way, trying to gain more support through other slaves through those rebellions. Eventually, all 3 of those rebellions were put down by militias. And those slaves that participated, and even some innocent slaves that did not participate but were just caught in a bad place at a bad time, were all put to death. Now, the abolitionist movement is going to be that movement that is going to be geared towards trying to get rid of slavery in the United States. And there's a number of ways in which people could participate. Abolitionists were not just white Northerners either. There were free African Americans living in the North that could also be part of the abolitionist movement, and even former slaves. So people who had escaped slavery in the South could also then lend their assistance and become part of the abolitionist movement as well. So some of the ways in which people would participate in this abolitionist movement would be by writing pamphlets. They could write essays, poems, newspaper articles, all geared towards kind of spreading the news and kind of sharing information about the abolitionist movement. Some abolitionists went on speaking tours, so they would travel around the United States, meeting in various cities, kind of explaining their view. And then others would be a little bit more extreme and more active and would actually be part of the Underground Railroad and help slaves escape. So you can see that tomorrow you have your test over slavery and westward expansion. There's a series of vocabulary words for each section, and a series of multiple choice questions for each section. So I would make sure that you study as much as you can so that you can be fully prepared to take your quiz or test, whichever you want to call it, tomorrow.